In any discussion of Greek exchanges of power, warfare, and strategy, you will inevitably encounter the infamous citizen soldiers of the city-states, known as the Hoplites. These warriors pose a unique way of fighting for us, one in which it's reliant on a few numbers, but nevertheless effective. Through the use of phalanx formations, they were discouraged from acting alone, as this would compromise the formation and minimize its strengths. While usually only considered in the context of military, Hoplites were dependent on specific armor, shields, and spear equipment that could usually only be afforded by middle or artisanal classes, and therefore they equally serve an economic role. They were primarily represented by free citizens, that is, propertied farmers and artisans, and therefore most Hoplites were not professional soldiers, and they often lacked formal military training. In a way, they are the idealized fighting force suited to a democracy. Primarily defined by shield and spear combat, the practicalities of Hoplite warfare are interesting to look at. The phalanx formation advanced units as a cohesive whole, rather than individuals, kind of akin to a modern rugby scrum. We can think of an individual Hoplite soldier as having a weak side, in which they held their weapon and therefore were less defended compared to their shield on the other hand. They often got around this by standing closer to other soldiers so that the next shield in line would overlap with the individual's exposed side, and then they would move cohesively together. In this sense, you had to rely on your comrades for part of your defense, which would have been enshrined in the sense of community and ideologically represents a democracy very, very well. Now, anyone familiar with terrain or the battle of things like Thermopylae or any other major Greek ones will know that phalanx formations are actually pretty difficult to set up properly. There are only a limited number of terrains and environments in which it's actually effective. Many Greek battles relied on being set up properly, having the right environmental conditions and the flat terrain, which meant pronounced weaknesses against certain weapon types, and notably against cavalry. Ironically, this style of warfare worked in regions around Thebes and Attica where the land was flatter, but struggled in the Peloponnese. While certainly ideologically effective at reinforcing state principles, the military applications can sometimes be a bit questionable. Literary testimonies to such battle conditions or the ineffectiveness of hoplite phalanxes are pretty numerous. Strabo, for instance, claims to have seen an inscribed pillar from an agon between Chalcis and Erythrea in the late 8th century that had conditions of warfare inscribed on it, including an agreement between parties fighting not to use missiles. Herodotus equally reports that the Persian Madonios ridiculed the Greek way of fighting on only the best and most level ground. In fact, in his first book, he also references a fascinating event in which there was an agreement between armies that took place before fighting. He says, "The Argives came out to save their territory from being cut off. Then, after debate, the two armies agreed that 300 of each side should fight, and whichever party won would possess the land. The rest of each army was to go away to its own country and not be present at the battle, since if the armies remained on the field, the men of either party might render assistance to their comrades if they saw them losing." This kind of thing inevitably makes us question the nature of warfare and rules of engagement in the Greek world. It clearly wasn't as simple as armies banging swords together. War itself had rules of engagement that presumably were ideologically based. There is a certain way in which Greek soldiers fight that was more or less agreed upon. The other downside of hoplite warfare is that your soldiers are in fact the same citizens who are producing the goods and fueling your economy back home. Big battles or drawn-out wars that take such people away from their properties for extended periods of time inevitably has consequences for food production, and few cities could actually sustain long-term warfare. In this line of thinking, people have frequently looked at hoplites as indicative of social change. Having a hoplite army not only requires the money or grain to upkeep them, but also offers the three citizens of Athens, what we would call today the middle class, the opportunity to mobilize. Different scholars have examined this power dynamic in different ways. The late John Salmon discussed hoplites arising from the perspective of political discontent among non-aristocratic families in the context of the tyrant revolution in the Archaic period. In the late 90s, Victor Davis Hanson reinforced the debate around agricultural revolutions, arguing that first what was needed was a change in how farming and food production occurred on a mass scale. In order to sustain a hoplite economy, aristocratic control of farmland had to be given way to a network of interconnected farming estates that could maintain production of weapons and rations. In the early 2000s, Hans van Wees went the other way, arguing that hoplite tactics were never static and that methods of battle continually evolved through a slow progression and refinement of strategy. And therefore, hoplite warfare was a consequence of, not the cause, of political change. In other words, while Salmon and Hanson believed that changes and developments in hoplite warfare pushed state ideologies towards corporation democracy, Van Wees instead believes that democracy was the ideological and state background that created the hoplite evolution. A lot of current debate lies in situating these kinds of developments in time, especially whether we have evidence of hoplite warfare that precedes or proceeds evidence of democracy. It's worth also considering the role of colonization in the formation of hoplite identity and power dynamics. Developments in phalanx strategies seem to coincide with developments and expansions of Greek colonization. As areas at the far reaches of the Greek world, such colonies are the avant-garde of society in which great change can occur, often through cultural interaction. While texts often tell us that such colonies were founded by aristocrats, the archaeology doesn't actually reflect this a lot of the time. Instead, it seems more like colonization is an arena in which radical social and political change occurs and sometimes can even feed back into mainland society. The question that needs to be asked, then, is how much of free citizen colonization is breaking aristocratic control, and what does this new dynamic look like? Especially if we look at the colonies in Magna Graecia, we are seeing evidence of new models of land ownership, agricultural development, and even trade, which allows for cheaper metal sources and a wider variety of not only weapon types, but also who's using the kinds of new weapons. There's a fair amount of archaeology focused around battlefields, especially recently in places like Himera in Sicily. We think we may have found evidence of the Battle of Himera around 480 BC, fought on the same day as the Battle of Salamis around the same time as the Battle of Thermopylae. This battle saw the Greek forces of Gelon, the king of Syracuse, and Theron, the tyrant of Argentium, defeat the Carthaginian forces, ending their bid to restore the deposed tyrant of Himera. The discovery of mass-lined graves in 2007 and 2008 seems to confirm the location and historicity of this conflict. In the mass graves, some skeletons even have evidence of their hands being tied behind their backs, along with spearheads in their shoulders, which may suggest execution after a conflict. The people buried in these mass graves may in fact have been prisoners of war. More so than the battle itself, though, isotopic analysis of the bones is turning up some interesting data around the ethnicity of people buried there. Such ADNA analysis is helping us identify whether these soldiers are local people or they're mercenaries who are being paid to come from abroad to fight in Greek conflicts. Such analyses can tell us more about the nature of warfare, but also about the internationality of conflict. In the same vein, there are discussions about how iconography can contribute to our understanding of hoplite warfare, especially with things like the Chieti vase from Italy. This 7th century vase depicts hoplites in conflict, accompanied by a young boy playing what seems to be an oulos flute, a kind of Greek flute, perhaps to provide the phalanx with a marching rhythm. Interestingly though, on the layer below this, we have figures in the same style of armour on horseback, acting seemingly as cavalry, which, considering everything we know, seems to go against standard hoplite tactics. We equally have quite a wide distribution of votive offerings resembling hoplites at religious sanctuaries, especially in the 5th-6th century Sparta and wider Laconia, particularly around things like the Menelaon. This act of votive deposition is perhaps reflecting wider religious changes in Greek society that reflect changes in hoplite importance, organisation, and value. So with that, thank you so much for watching. A bit of a shorter episode today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts about hoplites below.